It was a golden afternoon in late June, the sort that rarely lasted long in the English countryside, but was always spoken of as though it did. The village of Little Witchwood basked in a soft glow of sun, the roses flushed pink and the air heavy with elderflower and clipped lawns. At the heart of it all, Fernwood Hall stood like a dowager duchess in fine silk, handsome, aging with dignity, and used to being the center of attention. Lady Clarissa Dewhurst had outdone herself this year. Her annual garden party, a grand tradition in the county, was something of a social obligation. The bunting, strung with military precision across the hedges, fluttered in rhythm with the chatter of teacups and gossiping ladies. Young officers on leave looked terribly bored, local matrons paraded new hats, and there was a distinct aroma of cucumber sandwiches mingling with gin and discontent. Miss Marple, dressed in dove grey and seated beneath a flowering laburnum tree, was nursing a lukewarm cup of Darjeeling. She had been invited, more out of courtesy than expectation, and positioned herself, as always, where she could hear most but be noticed least. "It's the Americans this year," muttered Colonel Armstrong, balancing a scone and his cane. "If it isn't their music, it's their trousers, all wide-legged and short-tempered." Lady Dewhurst chuckled, fluttering her gloved hand. "Oh, Jeremy, do stop being a relic. The Americans won the war, after all." "They didn't win it with trousers," thought Miss Marple quietly, but sipped her tea without comment. It was shortly after the village choir's performance, a rather damp rendition of Greensleeves, that the incident occurred. A loud crack echoed across the lawn, a sound too sharp and deliberate to be anything so mundane as a champagne cork. There was a moment's pause, the kind that always follows an unfamiliar noise in a familiar setting, and then a shriek. People turned. The young maid, Elsie, barely out of school and too nervous for service, stood by the side hedge, her eyes wide, one gloved hand pressed to her mouth. He just fell, there behind the shrubbery. Oh, someone come quick." Several guests rushed over, murmuring began to rise. A man had collapsed. No, not collapsed. Fallen. No, been shot. Someone said there was blood. The vicar asked for space. A constable was summoned from the drinks tent. Miss Marple remained seated for a moment longer, her eyes on the hedge, her expression unreadable. "Who is it?" someone cried. "Never seen him before?" said Lady Dewhurst's son, frowning. "Not local." That was true enough. The man lying on the manicured grass behind the hawthorn hedge was well-dressed, but unfamiliar. 30-something, tall, a sharp suit, a red pocket square oddly unfashionable, and now stained with a growing patch of crimson. "Shot?" murmured Miss Hartley, aghast. The constable, red-faced from sun and ale, crouched awkwardly beside the body. "No sign of a weapon nearby," he reported. "And, yes, he's dead." A silence followed, uneasy, rippling outward through the garden like wind across still water. "But who was he?" someone whispered. "Who invited him?" I think he said his name was Mr. Anthony Fields," said a voice, hesitant. It was Miss Gilda Crampton, Lady Dewhurst's niece, her cheeks pale beneath her tan. "I spoke to him, briefly. He said he was visiting, that he used to come here years ago, but I don't—" She trailed off. Miss Marple stood, setting down her empty cup on the grass. "Curious," she said softly to no one in particular. "So curious. People rarely forget a place they've truly known, but sometimes they remember the wrong details altogether." She looked toward the body and then, quietly, turned her gaze to the guests, each one of them now caught in the frozen frame of a picture about to unravel. The sun had dipped just enough to throw long shadows over the lawn, cooling the buzz of the party into a series of tight, nervous clusters of conversation. What had begun with the peal of laughter and clinking teacups now simmered with the subdued muttering of disbelief. The stranger lay still, his face oddly peaceful for a man felled by sudden violence. His hat, a neat fedora with a faint dusting of summer pollen, had rolled a few feet from him, coming to rest by the hydrangea border. Gilda Crampton stood beside the constable, her hands twisting the hem of her pale blue gloves. He said he remembered the house, that he'd come here once as a child, but I've lived at Fernwood since I was 8 and I don't recall him at all. Miss Marple, drifting quietly closer to the gathering crowd, regarded Gilda with a softness that belied her scrutiny. People do tend to remember places differently, my dear, she said gently. Often through the fog of nostalgia, or worse, through someone else's story altogether. Lady Dewhurst was fanning herself with increasing agitation, although whether from heat or scandal was difficult to say. I can't think why someone would invent a connection to Fernwood. It's not that grand. Miss Marple offered a polite smile. Oh, but that's just the thing. A person invents a connection to a place for many reasons. To gain trust, to avoid questions, or sometimes, she added, because they genuinely believe they belong. The constable, young Mr. Pierce, green, earnest, and clearly unused to dealing with anything more serious than a poacher, straightened and cleared his throat. I'll need to speak to everyone who had contact with the deceased, he declared, with the stiff bearing of a man modeling himself after an idea of authority. Miss Crampton, you say you spoke with him? Gilda nodded. Only briefly. He arrived about an hour ago, just after the choir finished warming up. He was alone, and I thought perhaps he was from the Home Office or, well, something to do with planning. I'd never seen him before. And you're sure he said Anthony Fields? Yes, quite sure. He said he was happy to see the hydrangeas were still in the same place. That struck me as odd. Miss Marple tilted her head slightly. That would be odd, she murmured, given that Lady Dewhurst only moved the hydrangeas from the East Terrace 3 summers ago after the late Lord Dewhurst tripped over the border and nearly cracked a rib. Lady Dewhurst stiffened, then flushed. I hardly see how my late husband's clumsiness is relevant. But memory is relevant, Miss Marple interrupted gently. Especially false memory. No one replied immediately. The guests had begun slowly dispersing, some summoned by children needing supper, others reluctant to remain but too curious to leave. Fernwood's staff, looking stunned and a little frightened, hovered near the French doors, whispering in low voices. Pierce scratched at his notebook with a blunt pencil. I'll send word to the station, ma'am, he told Lady Dewhurst, and get Inspector Cray down from Limfold. We'll need a proper doctor, too, for the formal, confirmation. Oh, yes, Lady Dewhurst said faintly. Yes, of course. Do whatever's necessary. She turned and caught Miss Marple's eye, her composure visibly cracking. This sort of thing doesn't happen here, she said, as if making a final appeal to the natural order of things. No, Miss Marple replied softly. But when it does, it usually means something's been happening for quite some time already. Unseen, perhaps, but not unfelt. By early evening, the body had been removed, covered in a hastily borrowed picnic blanket. The guests had dispersed under the quiet directive of Lady Dewhurst's steward, and the constable had retired to the library to draft his initial report. Miss Marple, rather than leave, had been invited to stay for supper, not by formality, but out of an unspoken agreement between Lady Dewhurst and herself, a quiet suggestion that Miss Marple's presence might offer some fragile comfort or clarity. Dinner was subdued. Gilda picked at her asparagus, and Lady Dewhurst made a half-hearted attempt at serving salmon mousse, though no one seemed capable of swallowing more than a few bites. Outside, the lawns had returned to silence, broken only by the chirr of insects and the distant hoot of a tawny owl. It was during the cheese course, what little of it had been touched, that Lady Dewhurst finally asked what had been hanging between them all evening. Jane, forgive me, but do you think this man was here for me? Miss Marple folded her napkin with the precision of habit. "No, Clarissa," she said gently. "I don't think he was here for you, but I do think he came with purpose. People rarely wander into a place like Little Witchwood by accident." Gilda's fork clattered to her plate. "Then what was he doing here?" "Mean? Why today? Why the party?" Miss Marple's gaze drifted toward the French windows, beyond which the garden lay in shadowed quiet. "Parties are curious things," she said thoughtfully. "They collect people who wouldn't otherwise gather. Sometimes they give us excuses to be seen. Other times they offer cover for people who'd rather not be noticed. It's all a matter of intent." "But we still don't know who he was," Gilda insisted. "Even his name could be false." "Oh, quite possibly," Miss Marple agreed. "But a false name often reveals more than a real one. People tend to choose aliases that mean something to them." Gilda looked puzzled. "Like what?" "Childhood pets, favorite authors, former addresses. Or sometimes," she added, "a person whose life they once envied. I recall a Mr. Bertram Hensley who assumed the identity of a deceased schoolmate just to impress a lady from Tunbridge Wells. Very tragic ending, I'm afraid. Quite a lot of arsenic." Lady Dewhurst shivered. "You always did have the most alarming stories, Jane." "I find human nature rather insists upon being alarming," Miss Marple replied. "But very little of it is truly surprising once you've lived long enough in a village." There was a knock on the drawing-room door, and the steward entered with a folded telegram on a tray. "For Miss Marple," he said with visible surprise. Miss Marple accepted it with a frown and read it silently. "Curious," she murmured. "A reply from an acquaintance at the railway hotel in Exeter. I'd sent a note by the 4:10 post just after tea." Gilda blinked. But that was only... How could they have replied so soon? "I asked only for a simple confirmation," Miss Marple said calmly, "to check whether anyone matching the late Mr. Field's description had taken a room there recently. As it turns out, yes, 2 nights ago, under the name Anthony Fields, travelling alone, paid in cash." Lady Dewhurst set her wine-glass down with a sharp clink. "Then he wasn't here to meet anyone?" "Oh, I wouldn't say that," Miss Marple replied, folding the telegram neatly. "I rather think he was. The question is, did the person he came to meet know he was coming?" Silence again. And then Gilda, voice trembling slightly, asked, "Miss Marple, what if they did?" Miss Marple looked at her for a moment, the corners of her mouth drawing down ever so slightly. "Then, my dear," she said, "we are no longer dealing with a stranger's tragedy. We are dealing with someone's secret, a very old one, I suspect, and very carefully kept." She reached for her knitting bag beside her chair, withdrawing needles and a pale pink ball of yarn. As she cast on the first stitch, the air in the room changed, not with certainty, but with the slow, inevitable tightening of threads. "Secrets," she said softly, "are like dropped stitches. Sooner or later they unravel something bigger than themselves." The morning mist still clung to the hedgerows as Little Witchwood began to stir with a mixture of curiosity and unease. The news of the stranger's death had spread like wildfire overnight, and with dawn came a fresh wave of whispered speculation and half-formed theories. The village, usually so calm and predictable, was now humming with a quiet urgency that unsettled even the most placid souls. Miss Marple sat at her small breakfast table in her cozy sitting room, sunlight filtering through lace curtains, casting delicate patterns on the well-worn pages of her knitting. The previous evening's revelations circled in her mind like a slowly tightening noose. Anthony Fields, real or not, was a man with a purpose, and his sudden death was no accident of fate. As she prepared to leave for Fernwood Hall, the familiar knock came at the door. It was Constable Pierce, his face pale and determined. "Miss Marple, if you have a moment, the inspector's just arrived. Inspector Cray. He'd like to speak with you before the formal inquiry begins." Miss Marple nodded, gathering her shawl. "Of course, Constable. Lead the way." Fernwood Hall looked different in the soft morning light. More somber, the gaiety of the previous day replaced by a heavy silence. The guests had departed, and the grounds were mostly empty except for a few lingering staff and the occasional curious villager. Inside, the grand drawing-room was stripped of its finery. The floral arrangement seemed wilted, and the air carried a faint scent of damp earth and something less definable, perhaps anxiety. Inspector Cray was a man of middling height, with sharp eyes that missed nothing and a presence that commanded quiet respect. He greeted Miss Marple with a brief nod, the lines on his forehead betraying sleepless hours. "Miss Marple," he began, "I understand you have a keen interest in the case. I'd appreciate any insight you might have. The official investigation is underway, but I must confess, this is proving a particularly tangled affair." Miss Marple settled into a chair, her knitting resting momentarily on her lap. "Inspector, the truth is rarely as simple as it first appears. I find the details surrounding Mr. Fields puzzling, especially his claimed connection to Fernwood. Have you learned anything about his background?" Cray sighed. "Very little concrete. Our inquiries in Exeter confirmed a man named Anthony Fields did register at the railway hotel 2 nights ago, but beyond that, his trail grows cold. No known family, no employment records, nothing. It's as if he emerged from nowhere." "That absence of history is telling," Miss Marple mused. "People who vanish from records often have a past they want to forget, or someone else to forget for them. And yet, he chose this village to appear in. There must be a reason." "Indeed," Cray replied. "Which brings me to the other residents of Little Witchwood. We've begun interviews, but the reactions are, well, guarded. Not outright hostility, but something beneath the surface. Secrets, perhaps." Miss Marple smiled faintly. "Secrets are the currency of small villages, Inspector, and they often have a way of revealing themselves at the most inconvenient times." Cray gestured toward the window. "If you don't mind, I'd like to accompany you around the village today. Your knowledge of human nature and the local community could prove invaluable. I must admit, the officers under my command find the social subtleties here rather perplexing." Miss Marple nodded. "I'd be happy to help. Sometimes the smallest observation sheds light on the darkest mystery." The two left Fernwood Hall and began their slow walk through the village streets. The shops were opening and the regular morning routines were in motion, but there was a noticeable tension in the air. Passers-by glanced sideways at each other. Conversations hushed when strangers approached. Their first stop was the village post office, where the postmistress, Mrs. Calloway, greeted them with a polite but guarded smile. Her eyes flicked briefly toward the inspector's notebook as he introduced himself. "Morning, Mrs. Calloway," Miss Marple said sweetly. "I was wondering if you noticed anything unusual recently. Visitors, parcels, anything that might relate to Mr. Fields?" Mrs. Calloway's lips pressed into a thin line. "Well, now you mention it, there was a small package delivered for a Mr. Fields last week. Came by registered post. He wasn't in the village then, but I kept it safe. Haven't heard if it was collected." "Do you recall the sender?" the inspector asked. "A Mr. Harold Quinn from London," she replied. "He left no forwarding address, just said it was urgent and to hold until Mr. Fields arrived." Miss Marple exchanged a glance with Cray. "A London connection," she murmured. "Perhaps an old acquaintance." The postmistress nodded. "I hope it's not trouble." Next, they visited the village pub, the King's Arms, a weathered building fragrant with oak and wood smoke. The landlord, Mr. Harris, was wiping glasses behind the bar, his expression wary. "We heard about the man who died," he said quietly. "Stranger to these parts, that's for sure." "Did he visit the pub before the party?" Miss Marple asked gently. Mr. Harris scratched his chin. "No, not that I recall, but a fellow did come in the evening before, late, asking about directions and the history of Fernwood Hall. Seemed in a hurry and nervous." "Did you catch his name?" Cray inquired. "No," Harris said. "He paid cash and left quickly." Miss Marple frowned. Another man connected to the story, perhaps? Or the same man on a previous day? They left the pub with more questions than answers, and as they wandered toward the village green, the inspector noted Miss Marple's thoughtful silence. "What are you thinking, Miss Marple?" "That the puzzle pieces don't yet fit," she replied. "But something else troubles me. The man who was shot claimed a past here, but the people who should remember him don't or won't." Their path took them past the little chapel where the vicar, Reverend Bellamy, was preparing his morning sermon. He greeted them with a nod, but his eyes revealed a man unsettled by recent events. "Inspector, Miss Marple," he said, "I can offer little, I'm afraid." But the stranger seemed to be looking for someone. He asked if there was a place one could speak in private. Something about settling old debts. "Debts?" Miss Marple's knitting paused. "Did he say what sort?" The vicar shook his head. "No, only that they weighed heavily on him. A burden from years past," he said. Miss Marple exchanged a glance with Cray. "A man haunted by his past is a man dangerous enough to make enemies," she said. As they turned to leave, the vicar added quietly, "There's talk, too, about a family that once lived here, long ago, who vanished without explanation. Some say their history is still buried beneath the village." Miss Marple's eyes gleamed with interest. "Stories like that are seldom mere gossip, Reverend. They often contain threads of truth woven through the fabric of time." Back in the village square, the pair paused near the small market stalls just beginning to set up. An elderly woman caught Miss Marple's attention, a Mrs. Clemency Fox, known for her sharp tongue and sharper memory. "Mrs. Fox," Miss Marple called softly, "may I trouble you for a moment?" The woman looked up, surprise flickering across her lined face. "Well, if it isn't Jane Marple, what brings you out so early?" Miss Marple smiled. "A sad event, I'm afraid. A stranger came to Fernwood Hall and was found dead. Have you heard anything about him?" Mrs. Fox nodded slowly. "Aye, I heard the name Anthony Fields, though I never saw the man. But I remember an Anthony Fields from years ago, a young man from a family with some standing back in the 1920s, rumored to have disappeared after a scandal." The inspector raised an eyebrow. "What sort of scandal?" Mrs. Fox leaned closer, lowering her voice. "Some said he was involved in a love affair that ended badly. Others said debts. No one ever knew for sure. But the family moved away suddenly, and the house stood empty for years." Miss Marple's fingers twitched, picking up the rhythm of a stitch. "And do you know where that family went?" Mrs. Fox shrugged. "No one did. But every so often, people say you can still hear the piano playing at night from the old house on the hill." Miss Marple exchanged a meaningful glance with Cray. "Thank you, Mrs. Fox. That is most helpful." As they walked back toward Fernwood Hall, the weight of what they had learned settled heavily between them. The stranger's name was no coincidence. The past had returned to haunt Little Witchwood, and the threads of old stories were beginning to unravel. Somewhere in the village lay the key to the truth, the secret no one wanted to admit. And Miss Marple, with her quiet knitting and her keen, unyielding eyes, was already beginning to see the pattern emerging from the tangled weave of deception and memory. The afternoon sun filtered through the windows of Fernwood Hall's library, casting a golden glow over rows of leather-bound books and polished oak shelves. The air was heavy with the scent of old paper and faint traces of tobacco, a reminder of Lord Dewhurst's long-ago habits. Miss Marple sat near the window, her knitting needles clicking rhythmically as she pondered the fragments of the story that had begun to emerge. Inspector Cray, standing by the fireplace with his notebook tucked under his arm, glanced at her with a mixture of frustration and curiosity. "Miss Marple, you mentioned this old family who vanished in the 1920s. Could it be possible that our stranger is connected to them? It would explain the familiarity with Fernwood, despite the claims of those who live here," she replied softly. "And the name Anthony Fields is not as common as one might think." This man was either deliberately adopting a past or genuinely believed it his own. Cray nodded, rubbing his chin thoughtfully. We need to dig deeper into local records, property deeds, census data, anything that could shed light on this family and their history. Miss Marple smiled faintly. You might be surprised what one finds in parish records and the memories of those who have lived here a lifetime. Just then, the door opened and Gilda Crampton entered, her face pale but resolute. I heard the inspector was here. I thought perhaps I might be of some use. Miss Marple gestured to a chair. You are always of use, my dear. Please sit. Gilda's eyes flicked toward the fireplace. I've been thinking about the stranger's arrival. Something about the way he spoke, the hesitation, the pauses, suggested he was unsure of himself, as if trying to piece together a memory rather than recalling it. That's a keen observation, Miss Marple said. False memories often contain gaps filled by guesswork or desire. They reveal as much about the present as the past. Gilda frowned. But why come to Fernwood of all places if he wasn't sure? And why at a party full of people who knew nothing of him? Miss Marple sighed. Perhaps he sought to find someone or something to anchor his uncertain identity. Sometimes we seek the past not to remember it clearly, but to make peace with it. Cray looked at them both, then cleared his throat. I've arranged for access to the village archives tomorrow morning. It might provide the background we need. Good, Miss Marple said. Tomorrow then. Tonight we should all rest. Secrets have a way of revealing themselves in the quiet hours. The inspector hesitated, then added, There is one other matter. The package Mrs. Calloway mentioned, our missing Mr. Fields never collected it. We found it sealed at the post office this morning. Inside was a small leather-bound notebook. Miss Marple's fingers paused mid-knit. A notebook, perhaps a diary. Perhaps. We've brought it here for you to examine if you wish. Gilda's eyes sparkled with curiosity. May I see it? Miss Marple nodded, and the inspector carefully produced the notebook from his coat pocket. It was worn and edged with the soft patina of frequent handling. The cover bore no markings except a faint embossing of intertwined initials. A.F. Opening the first page, Miss Marple's eyes scanned the neat, looping handwriting. The entries were dated, but patchy, some weeks missing, others filled with painstaking detail. The words painted a picture of a man wrestling with memories, identities, and a past that refused to stay buried. I see references to the house on the hill, Miss Marple murmured, and to a secret kept too long. The writer speaks of unseen eyes and whispers in the night. It's a language of fear and regret. Gilda leaned closer. There's a passage here. If only I could remember the truth, perhaps the shadows would fade. Miss Marple's lips pressed into a thin line. He was searching for answers, but his own mind betrayed him. Cray looked uneasy. Could he have been mentally unwell? Confused? Possibly, Miss Marple replied. But confusion does not explain murder. There was a knock, and the steward entered, announcing a visitor. To their surprise, it was Harold Quinn, the man who had sent the package. His eyes were wary, and his gait hesitant as he stepped into the room. I understand you've been asking questions about Mr. Fields, Quinn said, his voice low. Miss Marple nodded politely. We have. You are his correspondent? Quinn swallowed, then replied, I suppose you could say that. We were old friends. Or we tried to be. Anthony and I shared a past that some would rather forget. Would you care to tell us more? Cray asked, folding his arms. Quinn glanced nervously at Miss Marple before sighing. Anthony was part of a family that lived here, many years ago, the Fields family. There was a scandal, something that tore them apart. Anthony left, tried to build a new life, but his past followed him like a shadow. And you kept in touch, Miss Marple prompted. For a time, Quinn admitted. Then the letters stopped. Until recently, when he reached out again, he said he was coming home to face what he'd left behind. Miss Marple's gaze was steady. And what exactly did he hope to find? Quinn hesitated. Redemption. Answers. Perhaps forgiveness. The room fell silent, the weight of unsaid things pressing down on them all. "Thank you, Mr. Quinn," Miss Marple said finally. "Your candor is appreciated. I suspect the past you speak of has much to do with what happened here." Quinn nodded and left as quietly as he had come. As the day waned, Miss Marple and Inspector Cray pored over the notebook's contents. Between the lines, they detected a trail leading to the old Fields estate. Long abandoned, its grand facade now draped in ivy and neglect. Miss Marple's voice was soft but certain. "Tomorrow, we must visit the house on the hill. I believe it holds the key to Anthony Fields' story and perhaps to the truth behind his death." The inspector agreed, and as dusk settled, a quiet resolve settled over Fernwood Hall. Outside, the village was beginning to settle into night, but inside Miss Marple's mind, the threads of memory and mystery were weaving closer, drawing her ever nearer to a secret that refused to remain hidden. The next morning dawned cool and clear. The mist from the previous day's early hours now lifted, revealing a sky so pale and wide it seemed to stretch endlessly above the gentle contours of Little Witchwood. Miss Marple and Inspector Cray met early at Fernwood Hall, prepared for their visit to the old Fields estate, the so-called house on the hill. The promise of answers, and perhaps more questions, loomed over them both as they set off. The drive was short but winding, the narrow country lanes flanked by ancient hedgerows, their gnarled branches twisting like fingers reaching out to obscure the past. As they approached the estate, the once grand manor emerged from the greenery, a melancholy silhouette of fading grandeur. Its stone facade was mottled with age, ivy clutching at cracked walls, windows like dark, hollow eyes staring into the village below. Miss Marple inhaled deeply. "This house has watched over generations of secrets," she murmured, "and now it's time to see what it remembers." They were greeted at the rusted iron gates by Mr. Pritchard, the current caretaker of the property, a wiry man in his 60s with keen eyes that betrayed years of solitary vigilance. He led them through the overgrown garden, the grass tall and unkempt, petals of once bright flowers scattered like forgotten memories. Inside, the house was a time capsule. Dust motes danced in shafts of light. Faded wallpaper peeled away to reveal layers of history, and heavy furniture sat shrouded beneath sheets. The silence was profound, broken only by their footsteps and the distant creak of the settling house. In the library, rows of books bore the marks of time and neglect. Miss Marple's fingers brushed over the spines, some titles familiar, others obscure. On a cluttered desk lay a leather-bound ledger, yellowed and fragile. She opened it carefully. The pages contained records of the family's financial affairs, letters, and some personal notes. Inspector Cray examined a portrait hanging above the fireplace, a stern-looking man in Victorian dress whose eyes seemed to follow them with quiet accusation. "That must be Jonathan Fields, the family patriarch," he said. "Yes," Miss Marple replied. "And there's a story hidden here, one of pride and fall, secrets and lies. But what exactly happened that caused the family's disappearance?" They turned their attention to a diary lying beneath a stack of papers. The handwriting was delicate and looping, signed by Margaret Fields, the eldest daughter. Reading aloud softly, Miss Marple began. "October 1923. Father's temper grows darker. Rumors swirl around the village, but none dare speak openly. Anthony is restless. He speaks of leaving, of a future beyond these walls. I fear the shadows that follow us are longer than the day." A chill seemed to settle in the room. Inspector Cray looked up. "So the trouble started long before anyone realized." "Yes," Miss Marple agreed, "and the family's sudden departure was no mere whim. They fled from something, A sudden sound interrupted them, the sharp click of footsteps in the hallway. The caretaker appeared again, looking more troubled than before. "There's someone here to see you," he said, "a Miss Evelyn March. She claims to have known the Fields family." Miss Marple's interest piqued. "Please, show her in." Moments later, a woman in her late 50s entered, her silver hair pulled back in a neat bun, eyes bright with both warmth and sorrow. She carried herself with the grace of someone accustomed to both society and secrecy. "Miss March," Miss Marple greeted her. "Thank you for coming. We're trying to piece together the history of this house and the Fields family." Evelyn nodded. "I was a close friend of Margaret Fields. We grew up here together. I remember the scandal that tore the family apart. But there's more than what's been whispered. Something darker." The inspector leaned forward. "Would you care to tell us?" Evelyn sighed deeply. "It began with Jonathan Fields' obsession with maintaining the family's reputation. When Anthony fell in love with a woman deemed unsuitable, tensions exploded. There were threats, arguments, and then, the night Anthony disappeared, the village was shaken by a terrible fire at the estate." Miss Marple's eyes narrowed slightly. "A fire?" "Yes," Evelyn confirmed. "Most believed it accidental, but Margaret always suspected otherwise. The fire destroyed many records and memories. The family scattered, and no one ever spoke of it again." "Did Anthony survive?" Cray asked. "Some say he fled," Evelyn said, "but others whisper he was lost that night, hidden away or worse. The truth was buried with the ashes." Miss Marple thought of the stranger's confusion, the desperate search for identity. "And the house remained empty?" "For years," Evelyn nodded, "until my father asked Mr. Pritchard to look after it. The detective work was beginning to form a pattern, but there were still too many gaps." Miss Marple's mind was like a web, each thread connecting to others in unexpected ways. The stranger's presence in the village, his death, and this buried family drama were all intertwined. Later that afternoon, back at Fernwood Hall, Miss Marple sat quietly with the notebook once again. She reread a passage Anthony had written. "The past is a cruel master, but its lessons must be faced, even if they break you." Her knitting forgotten, she pondered the phrase, realizing that Anthony's return had not been a simple quest for closure. He was entangled in something that someone wanted to keep hidden, so desperately that murder was the last resort. The inspector joined her, handing over a freshly printed map of the village and its surroundings. "We've identified a few properties linked to the Fields family and their associates. Perhaps a visit to those homes might shed light on hidden grudges or allies." Miss Marple nodded. "It is time to listen to the village itself. People's memories, however flawed, often carry the weight of truth." Their first call was to the home of Mrs. Harriet Barlow, a widow known for her sharp mind and social connections. Mrs. Barlow welcomed them with a guarded smile, but quickly warmed to the topic of the Fields family. "I remember the fire well," she said. "It was the talk of every household. But I also recall hearing that Jonathan Fields was not the man he appeared to be. Many suspected he had enemies beyond the village. Old debts, perhaps, or a tangled business that went sour." "Do you know if anyone else had cause to resent the family?" Miss Marple asked. Mrs. Barlow nodded slowly. "There was a man, Thomas Hargrave, a former business partner. Their falling out was bitter and public. Hargrave vanished soon after the fire. Some say he fled in disgrace. Others think he had a hand in the tragedy." Cray made a note. "Hargrave is worth looking into." As they left Mrs. Barlow's house, the village seemed to hold its breath around them, its collective past waiting to be unearthed. The next stop was the modest home of Mrs. Clemency Fox, the elderly woman with a memory as sharp as a hawk's. She greeted them with a mixture of suspicion and curiosity, but soon became an invaluable source. "Hargrave was no friend to anyone," she said firmly. But the Fields family had secrets even darker. Whispers of betrayal and hidden rooms in the manor. Some believed Anthony himself wasn't innocent in whatever happened that night. Miss Marple's eyes twinkled with the thrill of discovery. Sometimes the truth is a mirror, reflecting more than we expect. As dusk fell, they returned to Fernwood Hall, the shadows lengthening like the secrets still lurking in the corners of the village. Miss Marple sat quietly, her fingers once more resuming their knitting as the threads of the mystery wove closer together, each stitch bringing her nearer to the heart of the darkness beneath Little Witchwood's peaceful facade. The evening settled quietly over Little Witchwood, the soft glow of lamps spilling from windows into the deepening dusk. Yet, inside Fernwood Hall, the air was thick with contemplation. Miss Marple sat near the fire, the flickering flames casting dancing shadows upon her calm face as she folded the notebook gently, setting it aside. Her eyes, however, held a restless light, the mind behind them ceaselessly weaving together fragments of whispered secrets and half-remembered truths. Inspector Cray, pacing near the window, broke the silence. The villagers' stories are revealing more than I expected, but none of it fits neatly. Thomas Hargrave disappeared just after the fire, but no one has seen him since, and the suggestion that Anthony Fields might have had a hand in the disaster itself, that complicates everything. Miss Marple nodded slowly. Indeed, but suspicion often dances just beyond the edge of truth. We must be cautious not to mistake fear for guilt. Cray frowned. Then what's our next step? She looked up, her voice steady. We must visit those who are closest to the Fields family, not just in social terms, but those whose lives entwined with theirs in more private, sometimes darker ways. Who do you have in mind? Cray asked. Mrs. Lottie Penhaligon, Miss Marple said quietly. She was the housekeeper at the Fields estate during the time of the fire. Her perspective might illuminate details others overlooked or wished to forget. The following morning, the two set out through the village, the chill of early spring still lingering in the air. Mrs. Penhaligon's cottage sat near the edge of the woods, a tidy, modest place where the scent of freshly brewed tea mingled with the faint aroma of lavender. The housekeeper herself was a woman in her 70s, with sharp eyes and a demeanor that mixed courtesy with a hint of steel. Mrs. Penhaligon, thank you for seeing us, Miss Marple began warmly. We're trying to understand the events surrounding the Fields family's disappearance. Anything you might share would be most valuable. The housekeeper's gaze flickered, memories evidently weighing upon her. It's a hard thing to speak of, she admitted. The fire was no accident. I know that much. Cray's interest sharpened. How can you be so sure? She sighed, settling into her chair. The night of the fire, I was in the kitchen. I heard a noise, like someone moving quietly in the hall. I went to investigate and saw Master Anthony's door was ajar. When I peered inside, I saw a shadow moving, not Anthony's, but someone else's. Someone who didn't belong. Did you recognize this figure? Miss Marple inquired gently. Mrs. Penhaligon hesitated. Only by their coat. A long, dark coat with a distinctive clasp shaped like a serpent. I never saw the face, and then the smoke came and everything turned to chaos. Miss Marple's knitting paused as she considered this. A distinctive clasp, you say? That could be a clue. Mrs. Penhaligon nodded. Yes. I kept the clasp when I found it later, but I never dared to speak of it. I was loyal to the family, but fear silenced me. Cray exchanged a glance with Miss Marple. Do you still have this clasp? In a box, hidden away, she said. If you wish, I can show it to you. After a moment's deliberation, they agreed to see it. Mrs. Penhaligon retrieved a small wooden box from a locked drawer. Inside lay an ornate clasp, a serpent coiled elegantly in silver, its eyes set with tiny garnets that gleamed like embers. Miss Marple studied it thoughtfully. This is not common. It suggests a connection to someone of means and secrecy. Cray mused aloud. Could this belong to Thomas Hargrave? He was a man of some wealth and known for peculiar taste in jewelry. Miss Marple smiled faintly. It would be wise to find out. With this new lead, the investigation took a sharp turn. Returning to the village, they sought information on Hargrave's last known whereabouts. It emerged he had once lived at a grand house on the outskirts of Little Witchwood but had left suddenly years ago. Arriving at the property, they found it shuttered and quiet, the garden overrun with weeds and the paint peeling from the door. Yet, inside, signs of recent occupation suggested someone had been there not long before. Miss Marple's eyes fell on a small pile of papers on a dusty desk, letters, receipts, and a worn leather journal. She picked it up delicately and opened to the first page, where the handwriting was erratic but unmistakably Hargrave's. The entries painted a picture of a man consumed by paranoia and regret. The Fields' downfall was inevitable. Their pride blinded them, but I will not be their scapegoat, she read aloud. And here, a reference to a serpent's clasp, with a warning to guard the secret at all costs. Inspector Cray's voice was grim. Hargrave feared exposure. Whatever secret connected him to the Fields, it was deadly serious. Miss Marple turned a page, noting a sketch of a small room hidden behind a false wall in the Fields' estate, a sanctum where incriminating documents might have been concealed. As they left the house, a chill wind swept through the garden, whispering through the broken branches. The mystery was deepening, and Miss Marple felt the familiar pulse of anticipation. Back at Fernwood Hall that evening, she shared these findings with Gilda Crampton, who had been quietly assisting with local inquiries. If Hargrave's journal is accurate, then the fire might have been set to destroy that sanctum and the truth within. Gilda nodded, concern etched on her face. But who would want to kill Anthony now? If the past was buried, why dig it up again? Miss Marple's gaze was steady. Because some truths, when threatened with exposure, compel desperate acts, and sometimes the present is shaped more by fear than by reason. The following day, they returned to the Fields' estate, intent on locating the secret chamber described in Hargrave's journal. The manor, though dilapidated, still held its secrets tightly. Miss Marple, with her practiced eye, searched the library walls, running her hand along the paneling until her fingers found a faint seam. With a gentle push, a section of the wall swung inward, revealing a narrow passage and a small hidden room. Inside lay scattered papers, mouldy but legible, and a locked box secured with an old iron clasp. Cray picked the lock with care, and inside they found a collection of letters, financial records, and photographs. Evidence of illicit dealings, betrayals, and a tangled web of debts and threats that spanned years. Miss Marple's eyes shone with quiet triumph. Here lies the heart of the matter, the truth someone killed to protect. But as they gathered the documents, a sudden noise startled them, footsteps in the hallway, hurried and tense. The door creaked open to reveal Harold Quinn, the man who had once corresponded with Anthony Fields. His face was pale, eyes darting nervously. "I couldn't let you find this," he said, voice trembling. "Some secrets should stay buried." Before they could react, Quinn lunged toward the papers, but Miss Marple's quick hand stopped him. "Mr. Quinn, violence will only hasten the truth's release. Tell us why you came here." Quinn sank into a chair, exhaustion and fear etched deep. "I loved Anthony in my way. But the past destroyed him, and if these papers were found, the entire village's reputation would crumble. I tried to protect what little remained." Miss Marple's voice was gentle but firm. "And yet protection turned to murder. Why kill the stranger who came home seeking answers?" Quinn looked away. "Because he threatened to expose everything, and because the past is a ruthless master." The night deepened, and with it, the fragile mask of civility began to crack. Miss Marple, ever patient, knew the final pieces were close, but only when all truths were laid bare would the final knot untangle. Outside, the village slept, unaware of the shadows creeping closer. Inside, The tangled web of little Witchwood's secrets was slowly unraveling, one thread at a time. The confession, hesitant and fragmented, hung heavy in the dim light of the secret chamber. Quinn's hands trembled as he fidgeted with a loose thread on his worn jacket, eyes fixed on the scattered papers before him, as though willing them to disappear. Miss Marple watched him quietly, her gaze patient but unyielding. "You say you loved Anthony," she said softly, "but that love was tangled with fear and silence. What exactly did the stranger threaten to reveal?" Quinn swallowed hard, then sighed. Anthony was not the only one involved. There were others, villagers whose reputations depended on the past remaining hidden. When the stranger came back, he brought questions no one wanted answered. "I thought if I stopped him, if I stopped the past from speaking, I could protect everyone." Inspector Cray's voice was steady but edged with frustration. "But killing him has only made the past louder." Quinn nodded, defeated. "I see that now." Miss Marple leaned forward. "Mr. Quinn, your truth is a necessary part of this story, but it cannot be the final chapter. There are still pieces missing, motives, secrets, shadows that have yet to be revealed." Quinn looked up sharply. "There's more, then?" "Yes," she said. "We must understand who else feared the stranger's return, and why." The following days were a slow unraveling of long-held village secrets. Miss Marple and Inspector Cray returned to the heart of Little Witchwood, their inquiries probing beneath the genteel surface of daily life. The villagers, initially guarded, began to open in fits and starts, each revelation a small fissure in the facade. One afternoon, Miss Marple visited the local postmistress, Mrs. Elsie Harcourt, a woman whose curiosity often outpaced discretion. Over cups of strong tea, Mrs. Harcourt recounted overheard conversations and letters that hinted at jealousies and old grudges. She spoke particularly of Lady Agatha Bellamy, a woman of wealth and influence whose family had long-standing ties to the Fields. "Lady Bellamy was never fond of the Fields," Mrs. Harcourt said, stirring her tea thoughtfully. "She believed their decline tarnished her family's name. There were rumors she disapproved of Anthony's choices, especially his involvement with certain questionable acquaintances." Miss Marple's interest piqued. "Questionable acquaintances?" Mrs. Harcourt lowered her voice. "Whispers of gambling debts, late-night meetings, and dealings that didn't quite fit the image of a respectable family." Later, visiting Lady Bellamy's grand home on the village outskirts, Miss Marple observed the sharp lines of the lady's face, the cool reserve behind her polished manners. Over a measured conversation, Lady Bellamy denied any wrongdoing but subtly suggested that Anthony's recklessness had brought ruin upon himself and others. "The past is full of mistakes," Lady Bellamy said, her tone icy. "Some best left forgotten." Yet beneath her words lay an unmistakable undercurrent of fear. Fear that the past might resurface and shake the very foundations of Little Witchwood's carefully maintained order. As the investigation continued, a pattern emerged. Nearly everyone connected to the Fields had something to hide. Old debts, affairs, betrayals, threads that wove a tapestry of intrigue and resentment. Miss Marple's quiet observations pieced together the social tensions that had simmered beneath the village's polite veneer for decades. One evening, while reviewing notes, Miss Marple noticed a small detail she had overlooked, a reference to a woman named Clara Gibbons, mentioned briefly in several letters, but never spoken of openly. "She's the key," Miss Marple told Inspector Cray. "The one everyone avoids mentioning." They found Clara in a modest cottage on the village edge, a woman in her 40s with eyes that flickered between caution and defiance. Clara was reluctant at first, but gradually, under Miss Marple's gentle probing, she revealed a story of love and betrayal. She had been Anthony Field's secret confidant, the bearer of truths too dangerous for public ears. "It wasn't just the family secrets," Clara confessed. Anthony had discovered something about Lady Bellamy's dealings, something that could ruin her reputation. He wanted to expose it, to set things right, but he underestimated how fiercely some would fight to keep their secrets. Her words cast new light on Lady Bellamy's fear and Quinn's desperation. The stranger, in his confusion and search for identity, had unwittingly stumbled upon a powder keg of secrets. Miss Marple's mind worked steadily, connecting the dots. The fire, the hidden room, the serpent clasp, the silences, all threads of a web spun tight with lies and fear. But one question remained. Who had the most to lose? The answer came unexpectedly. A call from the village solicitor, Mr. Hemming, summoned them to his office. There, in a dusty ledger, lay documents revealing Lady Bellamy's financial dealings, embezzlement and cover-ups that implicated her directly in the Fields family's downfall. Faced with undeniable evidence, Lady Bellamy's composure cracked. In a final confrontation at Fernwood Hall, Miss Marple laid out the pieces with gentle precision, revealing how Lady Bellamy had orchestrated the ruin of the Fields, the cover-up of the fire, and the murder of the stranger to protect her legacy. "The past you feared has caught up with you," Miss Marple said softly, "and justice, in its quiet way, has been served." As the village breathed a tentative sigh of relief, Miss Marple reflected on the fragile balance of human nature, the intertwining of love, fear, and ambition that shapes lives and destinies. In the end, Little Witchwood would never be quite the same, but the shadows had been brought to light, and with them, the promise of a future less burdened by secrets. The revelation at Mr. Hemming's office marked a turning point in the investigation, yet Miss Marple sensed the final piece of the puzzle remained just out of reach. The villagers were shaken, whispers swelling like a rising tide, and while Lady Bellamy's confession was damning, something about the sequence of events still seemed incomplete. The night of the fire, the sudden disappearance of Thomas Hargrave, the strange visitor who arrived just before chaos ensued, each thread pointed to a more tangled weave beneath the surface. Miss Marple found herself returning to Fernwood Hall, where the quiet order of the village was briefly restored. As she settled into her favorite armchair, a pot of tea steaming nearby, her mind sifted through the facts once more. The serpent clasp, so distinctive and symbolic, had linked Thomas Hargrave to the fire and to Lady Bellamy's secret dealings. Yet the clasp had been found by Mrs. Penhaligon, who had kept it hidden. Why had she not mentioned it sooner? And what had prompted Quinn to act with such desperation? The next morning, Miss Marple requested a private conversation with Mrs. Penhaligon. The housekeeper appeared hesitant but agreed, perhaps sensing the detective's kindly persistence was not to be defied. "Mrs. Penhaligon," Miss Marple began gently, "I wonder if there is something you feel you have not yet told us. The clasp you found, the shadow you saw that night. Do you believe the figure belonged to Mr. Hargrave?" The woman's eyes flickered. Then she nodded slowly. "Yes, but it was more complicated than that. Mr. Hargrave was here, yes, but he was not alone. There was someone else, a figure I could not quite see clearly, who hurried away as the fire took hold." Miss Marple's eyes sharpened. "Someone else?" "Yes. I believe they were the ones who set the fire. I think they wanted to make it look like an accident, but the truth is they hoped to silence Mr. Hargrave and the stranger both." "Do you know who that might be?" Mrs. Penhaligon hesitated, then lowered her voice. "There was always talk, long ago, about the estate manager, Mr. James Armitage. He was loyal to Lady Bellamy, but he had a temper and a hidden grudge against the Fields family. He disappeared shortly after the fire, and no one has seen him since." The mention of Armitage stirred something in Miss Marple's memory. Brief, vague accounts she had heard during her earlier inquiries, quickly dismissed as irrelevant. Yet now, with this renewed emphasis, a new avenue opened. Inspector Cray was summoned, and together they set out to track down the elusive Armitage. Their search led them beyond the village borders to a small, neglected cottage deep in the woods. The place seemed abandoned, but footprints in the soft earth suggested recent visitors. Inside, the air was stale, the remnants of a hurried departure evident. A journal lay open on the table, and Miss Marple's fingers brushed across the pages, reading the jagged handwriting that revealed bitterness, fear, and a twisted sense of loyalty. Armitage's words painted a picture of a man consumed by resentment, convinced that the Fields family's downfall was a betrayal of his own service. He hinted at a plan to protect Lady Bellamy's secrets at any cost, even if it meant burning down the estate and silencing those who threatened exposure. The discovery deepened the mystery, and yet no sign of Armitage himself could be found. Miss Marple deduced he was still nearby, watching, perhaps waiting for the right moment. Returning to the village, the detective and inspector found the atmosphere charged with tension. The villagers were unsettled, their own fears and suspicions stirring anew. Miss Marple felt the delicate balance of the investigation shift, as if the final act was drawing near. One afternoon, as she wandered through the village market, Miss Marple noticed a familiar figure. Harold Quinn, standing stiffly near a stall, eyes flickering nervously. Approaching him with her usual calm, she gently broached the subject. "Mr. Quinn, have you seen or heard anything of Mr. Armitage recently?" Quinn's face paled. I thought he'd left for good, but now I fear he's still here, lurking in the shadows, waiting." Miss Marple's gaze was steady. "And if he is, what do you think he wants?" "To finish what he started," Quinn whispered. "To protect Lady Bellamy and himself, by any means necessary." That evening, back at Fernwood Hall, the pieces fell into place. The fire was no accident, nor was it solely an act to silence Thomas Hargrave. Armitage had orchestrated the blaze, using the confusion to disappear and cover his tracks. His motive was twisted loyalty, willing to burn the past and anyone caught in the flames to protect the village's secrets and Lady Bellamy's name. Miss Marple knew the final confrontation was imminent. With Inspector Cray, she devised a plan to draw Armitage out. They would use the documents found in the hidden sanctum as bait, letting the knowledge that the truth was resurfacing spread quietly among the villagers. Within days, the atmosphere grew electric. Villagers whispered of shadowy figures and sudden noises in the night. Then, late one evening, a figure appeared at Fernwood Hall's gates. Tall, gaunt, eyes sharp and restless. It was James Armitage. He was taken quietly inside, where Miss Marple greeted him not with accusation, but with a patient kindness that unsettled him. "Mr. Armitage," she said gently, "you've lived too long in fear and silence. The past is no longer yours to guard alone." Armitage's defenses faltered. His story spilled forth. A tale of devotion twisted by anger, of secrets kept in darkness, and mistakes too painful to admit. Miss Marple listened without interruption, then spoke with quiet authority. "There is a chance for redemption, but only if the truth is met with honesty. Your actions have caused harm, but understanding may heal what fear has broken." Inspector Cray moved to take Armitage into custody, but the detective's soft words seemed to ease the man's burden. As dawn broke over Little Witchwood, the village awoke to a fragile peace. The secrets of the past had been unveiled, the mystery resolved not through violence or spectacle, but by the steady light of truth and human understanding. Miss Marple sat quietly by the window of Fernwood Hall, the soft hum of village life drifting through the morning air. She reflected on the nature of secrets and the shadows they cast, knowing that while some stories end, the human heart continues to harbor mysteries of its own. In Little Witchwood, life would carry on, changed perhaps, but wiser, and Miss Marple, ever watchful, remained its quiet guardian. Despite the apparent resolution, a lingering unease settled over Little Witchwood, as if the village's breath had been held too long and now hesitated to exhale. Miss Marple was keenly aware that the uncovering of James Armitage's role, though pivotal, did not close every door. Questions remained unanswered, and the village's quiet fabric was still fraying at the edges. The delicate peace was fragile, and Miss Marple's instincts told her the final act of this long drama was yet to unfold. It began with the disappearance of several letters from the field's archive, documents that had been carefully catalogued and locked away in the village solicitor's office. The theft was subtle, noticed only because a certain letter, one bearing a strange and unexpected signature, was missing. This absence disturbed Miss Marple more than she let on. The letter had been key to understanding some of the deeper undercurrents surrounding Anthony Fields's dealings, and its loss hinted that someone was determined to keep certain truths hidden at all costs. The village gossips were abuzz with speculation. Some suggested a disgruntled relative, others whispered of old debts and vengeance. But Miss Marple, with her calm and measured approach, knew better than to rely on mere hearsay. She began quietly visiting the villagers again, listening and observing with her usual subtlety. At the local inn, she encountered Harold Quinn, whose nervousness had not diminished despite Armitage's capture. "Miss Marple," he confided, "I fear there are others, people who stand to lose everything if certain letters see the light of day. Armitage was just one piece of a larger puzzle." Miss Marple nodded thoughtfully. "And who do you suspect, Mr. Quinn?" He hesitated, then whispered, "Lady Bellamy's solicitor, Mr. Hemming. He's been too helpful, too eager to bury old documents. I don't trust him." The mention of Hemming sent a ripple through Miss Marple's mind. She recalled his composed demeanor and smooth words, the way he had carefully guided the investigation's early stages. Was it possible he was playing a double game? The idea was unsettling, yet it fit the pattern of hidden loyalties and quiet deceptions. A plan began to form. Miss Marple arranged a discreet meeting with Inspector Cray, sharing her suspicions. Together, they decided to monitor Hemming's activities without alerting him to their doubts. They began by requesting access to the solicitor's office under the pretense of reviewing remaining documents, all while carefully observing who came and went from the building. One afternoon, as Miss Marple and Cray waited in the shadowed doorway of the solicitor's office, a Bartanisa figure approached, Hemming himself. He carried a small locked box, and his demeanor was brisk, almost tense. They watched as he slipped inside, locked the door behind him, and began searching through his desk. Minutes later, a sudden noise, a faint thud, echoed from within. Miss Marple exchanged a glance with Cray, who immediately moved to knock on the door. Hemming's voice called out smoothly, "Just a moment, Inspector. I'm dealing with something delicate." The two exchanged a look of skepticism, but waited until the door opened to admit them. Inside, the office was as orderly as ever, except for a small piece of paper on the floor that neither Hemming nor his assistant had noticed. Miss Marple bent to pick it up, her eyes narrowing. The paper was a receipt for the purchase of a nearby safe deposit box, one registered under an alias. "That is most interesting," she murmured. Under gentle but firm questioning, Hemming's calm facade cracked. He admitted to renting the box, but claimed it was for personal reasons unrelated to the investigation. Miss Marple was unconvinced and persuaded the authorities to obtain a warrant to inspect the contents. Inside the box were several letters and documents, some duplicates, others revealing financial transactions linking Lady Bellamy's estate with suspicious offshore accounts. Among them was a letter that matched the missing one from the field's archive, bearing a cryptic warning to someone named E. The discovery confirmed Miss Marple's suspicions. The web of deception extended beyond Lady Bellamy and Armitage, reaching into the very heart of the village's legal and financial affairs. With mounting evidence, Hemming was detained for further questioning. But even as he protested his innocence, Miss Marple's quiet confidence never wavered. She knew that behind his smooth words and polished manner lay a desperate man guarding secrets that could topple not only reputations, but the fragile peace of Little Witchwood itself. The villagers listened anxiously as the story unfolded, how trust had been betrayed and how greed and fear had poisoned the roots of their community. Yet, as Miss Marple often reflected, such revelations were also opportunities for renewal. In the midst of the turmoil, Miss Marple found herself drawn to the once dismissed stranger's memory. His confusion and mistakes had set this chain of events into motion, but in truth, it was the village's collective silence and buried secrets that allowed the darkness to flourish. One evening, as twilight deepened, Miss Marple walked slowly through the village lanes. The familiar faces passed by, some wary, others resigned, but all touched by the changing tide of truth. She understood that justice was not simply about punishment. It was about bringing light into shadows, about understanding the frailties of human nature that lead to concealment and crime. Returning to Fernwood Hall, she sat by the fire with Inspectors Cray, who admitted his admiration for her subtle but relentless pursuit of the truth. "Miss Marple," he said, "I have never seen a case so deeply rooted in the social fabric of a place, and never one solved so quietly." She smiled softly. "Crime often wears the mask of everyday life, Inspector. It is in the small details, the fleeting glances, and the hesitations where the truth resides. And in places like Little Witchwood, where everyone knows each other, it takes patience to unravel the hidden stories." Their conversation was interrupted by a knock at the door. It was Harold Quinn, bearing news that set the room briefly silent. A final letter had been discovered in the possession of an elderly villager, long thought irrelevant, but in truth a key to the mystery. The letter revealed that the stranger had been more than just a confused outsider. He was the illegitimate heir to part of the Bellamy estate, a fact Lady Bellamy had desperately tried to conceal. His return was a threat not just to the past, but to the future inheritance of wealth and power. This new revelation cast the entire mystery in sharper relief. The motives, the betrayals, and the desperate acts of violence all stemmed from fear. Fear of loss, of exposure, and of change. Miss Marple felt the final pieces shifting into place. She prepared for the delicate task ahead, to confront Lady Bellamy once more, this time with undeniable proof and the weight of the village's collective gaze. As the night deepened, the quiet village seemed to hold its breath, awaiting the conclusion that would finally lift the veil from the tangled heart of Little Witchwood. The air in Fernwood Hall was heavy with quiet tension as Miss Marple prepared for what she sensed would be the final confrontation. The letter, uncovered by Harold Quinn, rested on the polished surface of the writing desk, its worn edges a silent testament to years of secrecy and suppressed truth. The discovery that the stranger, whose confused recollections had first unsettled the village, was in fact the illegitimate heir to part of the Bellamy estate, cast a new, unyielding light upon the entire mystery. Lady Bellamy, who had until now presented herself as dignified and composed, was soon to face a reckoning. But Miss Marple understood the delicate nature of this moment. It was not merely a matter of exposing facts, it was about unraveling the tangled emotions and motivations that had driven each participant to desperate actions. The old lady's pride, fear, and perhaps even a misplaced sense of protection for the village had shaped her choices, and in such matters, patience and tact were paramount. Inspector Cray stood quietly by the fireplace, hands clasped behind his back, his expression unreadable. He trusted Miss Marple's judgment implicitly, but he was also a man of law, eager to see justice served. "Are you certain, Miss Marple," he asked softly, "that this is the right moment?" She nodded, folding the letter gently. "Yes, Inspector. The truth has been circling like a shadow for too long. It is time to bring it into the light, but with kindness rather than fury." Their plan was simple yet profound. to invite Lady Bellamy to a private meeting under the pretense of discussing the future of the estate, while carefully guiding the conversation toward the revelations the letter contained. The detective hoped that, given the right moment and the right words, Lady Bellamy would confess, or at least reveal the final secrets that had eluded them. When Lady Bellamy arrived, dressed impeccably as always, her eyes betrayed a flicker of unease beneath her usual composure. Miss Marple greeted her warmly, inviting her to sit by the large bay window where the soft afternoon light filtered through lace curtains. "Lady Bellamy," Miss Marple began gently, "we have come across some documents that cast a different light on recent events. It seems there are more truths beneath the surface than any of us realized." The older woman's fingers tightened around her teacup, her gaze flicking to the letter Miss Marple placed between them. "You have something to tell me, then," Lady Bellamy said quietly, her voice steady but fragile. Miss Marple inclined her head. "Yes, and I believe it would be best to hear it from you." The stranger who arrived in Little Witchwood, confused and mistaken as he was not just an outsider. He was a man with a rightful claim, a claim you sought to protect, perhaps at too great a cost. Lady Bellamy's eyes filled with tears, but there was no anger, only a profound sadness. "It was not pride alone that drove me," she admitted. "It was fear. Fear of scandal, of shame upon this village and family. If the truth had been known, it would have undone everything we worked for. Yet the truth has a way of emerging," Miss Marple said softly. "And sometimes the cost of hiding it is far greater than the consequences of honesty." Lady Bellamy's shoulders sagged as she recounted the years of concealment, the whispered threats, and the desperate decisions that had spiraled into tragedy. The fire, the mysterious visitor, the betrayals. They were all threads woven from the fabric of protection and fear. As she spoke, the weight of her confession seemed to lift a burden from the room. Miss Marple listened with gentle sympathy, understanding that the village's harmony had been disrupted not just by crime, but by human frailty. After a long pause, Lady Bellamy looked up. "What will become of me now?" Miss Marple smiled kindly. "Justice will follow its course, but so too will understanding. You're not alone in this." Later, as the news spread through Little Witchwood, reactions varied from shock to relief. The villagers found themselves confronting their own prejudices and assumptions, their shared history suddenly cast in new light. Miss Marple's subtle genius had once again brought clarity, not through force but through insight. She had seen beyond the surface, into the hearts of those involved, and guided them toward a resolution that, while painful, was necessary. In the quiet aftermath, life in the village began to settle into a new rhythm. The estate passed into the rightful hands, and the community slowly healed, bound by the lessons of trust and truth. Sitting once more in her favorite chair at Fernwood Hall, Miss Marple reflected on the delicate balance of human nature, the capacity for kindness, fear, deception, and ultimately, redemption. She knew that in every village, no matter how peaceful it seemed, secrets lay waiting beneath the surface, and that her role was to gently uncover them, piece by piece, until justice and understanding could prevail. And so, as the sun set over Little Witchwood, Miss Marple prepared herself for the next mystery, ever watchful, ever patient, and forever quietly wise. The late afternoon sun cast a warm, golden glow over Little Witchwood, but beneath that gentle light, a final truth awaited revelation. Miss Marple sat quietly in the drawing-room of Fernwood Hall. The assembled villagers gathered around with a mixture of anticipation and unease. The web of secrets had been slowly untangled, yet the true heart of the mystery, the reason behind the stranger's confused memory, the real motive behind the murder, remained to be fully uncovered. Miss Marple cleared her throat softly, her voice calm and measured, drawing all eyes upon her. "Thank you all for coming. I believe it is time to bring to light the final piece of this perplexing puzzle." She glanced briefly at Lady Bellamy, whose dignified posture betrayed the strain of recent revelations, and then at Inspector Cray, who stood attentively nearby. "From the outset," Miss Marple began, "this mystery seemed to rest on an outsider's confused recollections and a seemingly inexplicable act of violence. Yet, as we have learned, appearances can be deceiving." She paused, letting the weight of her words settle before continuing. "The stranger, as we now know, was the illegitimate heir to part of the Bellamy estate, a fact concealed for many years. This revelation was enough to threaten those who wished to preserve the family's reputation and control over their affairs. But the key question remains: why was Mr. James Armitage, the man who ultimately died, involved in this tragic chain of events?" A hush fell over the room. Miss Marple continued, "Armitage was more than a gardener or a simple villager. He was a man burdened by guilt and regret, holding knowledge he dared not reveal. You see, Armitage had once been entrusted with safeguarding a letter containing evidence that could have confirmed the stranger's claim and upended the Bellamy legacy." She looked directly at Mr. Harold Quinn, who gave a slight nod. He confided in Mr. Quinn about his fears and intended to come forward with the truth. But fear and hesitation can be dangerous companions, and it was that hesitation that led to his demise. Turning to Lady Bellamy, Miss Marple's gaze softened. It was not murder born solely of cruelty, but of desperate protection. You wished to guard your family's name and the village's peace, yet those actions created a chain reaction that none could have foreseen. Lady Bellamy swallowed hard, but nodded in acknowledgement. Miss Marple then addressed the room. The true murderer was not the stranger, nor the unfortunate Armitage alone, but rather the tangled web of secrets, fears, and silent agreements that suffocated honesty and bred suspicion. Inspector Cray stepped forward. "With Miss Marple's insights and the evidence uncovered, the authorities are prepared to proceed with formal charges. But it is also a time for reflection, for us all to consider how the shadows of the past can poison the present." As the villagers absorbed the full weight of Miss Marple's words, a profound quiet settled. The truth had been laid bare, not through dramatic confession or force, but through patient observation and gentle persuasion. The mystery that had threatened to tear the village apart was resolved not by rage, but by understanding. Miss Marple rose gracefully, her expression serene. Little Witchwood will heal in time, and while no one can change what has happened, we can learn to face the future with open eyes and honest hearts. The villagers slowly began to disperse, some with tears, others with a newfound respect for the quiet detective who had seen through their masks. Miss Marple lingered for a moment, gazing out toward the village she had come to know so intimately. The lessons of human nature, in all its complexity, were endless, and so too was her work. As the sun dipped below the horizon, Miss Marple knew that peace had returned. For now, but the subtle art of understanding would always be her greatest tool in the pursuit of truth.